Every night, my husband gives me a vitamin and kisses my forehead. One day, I pretend to take it and throw it away. Hi, welcome to Family Revenge. Enjoy my new story.
That night, I pretended to take the pill he gave me every evening. Hours later, I heard him whispering on the balcony with his mistress. "She's getting weaker," he said. "Good. Soon everything will be ours," she laughed. Then he added almost casually, "She could never have children." I made sure of that. A pause. "And she still thanks me for taking care of her," he said softly. They laughed. And in that moment, something inside me died. But what replaced it was far more dangerous. Thank you for being here truly. Now tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Your city, your country? I want to know. Please note, some elements of this story are fictional, created for storytelling and educational value. Similarities to any names or locations are coincidental, but what this story means, that part is entirely real. September 2025, Upper West Side, Manhattan. The mirror doesn't lie. That's what people say, isn't it? It shows you exactly who you are. No filters, no flattery, no careful arrangements of light and shadow. Just you and whatever you've become. I've been standing in front of this one for about 10 minutes, floor to ceiling, framed in brushed brass at the far end of my bedroom in the penthouse I moved into 14 months ago. 63rd floor. Central Park stretched out below, like something from a dream someone else is having. Everything in this apartment is beautiful, and every single thing in it I chose for myself, which I've come to understand is a luxury I didn't always have. My name is Vivian Hartwell. I'm 56 years old. I built the Hartwell Grand Hotels from a single property in Savannah, Georgia, into a collection of 12 boutique luxury hotels across the eastern seaboard. I've sat across boardroom tables from men twice my size who assumed, because I smiled warmly and spoke carefully, that I could be managed. I've navigated financial crises, hostile acquisitions, and the particular kind of institutional skepticism that greets any woman who has the audacity to be both successful and unapologetic about it. I tell you this not to impress you. I tell you this because you need to understand who I was before I tell you what happened to me. Because if you don't understand who I was, you'll spend this entire story asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, how could she not have known? The right question, the only question that matters, is, how does something like this happen to someone like her? That is exactly what I'm going to answer. Let me take you back to a house I no longer live in, the Hartwell Estate on Round Hill Road, Greenwich, Connecticut, Georgian colonial, 8 bedrooms. A rear terrace overlooking 3 acres of formal gardens, and beyond that, the glittering expanse of Long Island Sound. The hydrangeas along the south wall were the color of old lavender. The front door was painted a deep navy blue that I picked out myself in the first month after we moved in. I remember standing at the top of the drive, looking back at it and thinking, this is the life you worked for. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. The house was also the most effective cage I have ever inhabited. Not because of its walls or gates, because of the man who lived inside it with me. Dorian Hartwell, my husband for 20 years. If you passed him on the street, you would have noticed him immediately. Tall, measured in the way he moved. Silver at the temples in that way that looks distinguished rather than old on certain men. Financial law was his profession, and he was exceptional at it. His name circulated quietly in the highest circles of Connecticut and New York, money spoken with the reverence old wealth reserves for people who know how to protect it. He was attentive. He remembered the names of every maitre d' we frequented, the birthdays of my staff, the precise way I took my coffee. In the early years, I used to joke that living with Dorian was like being permanently attended to by someone who had studied you so thoroughly he could finish your sentences before you form them. I thought that was love. I thought that was intimacy. I understand now that it was something else entirely. It started with what I was told were vitamins. Every evening, without exception, Dorian would appear in whichever room I happened to be in, carrying 2 things. A glass of room temperature still water and a small jade-colored dish containing a single pink capsule. "Swiss formulation, sweetheart," he said the first time, pressing the glass gently into my hand. "The best money can buy. I want to make sure you're always at your best." He would kiss my forehead. He would wait until I swallowed. Then he would smile that warm, unhurried smile and say goodnight. I didn't question it. Why would I? The man was being thoughtful. He was being a husband. But things began to shift in ways I couldn't quite name. I started sleeping longer, not the deep, restorative sleep of genuine rest, but something heavier. Something I had to claw my way out of every morning. I would lose stretches of afternoon quietly the way time disappears when you're not quite present in your own life. I would wake with a fatigue so dense it had weight. I told Dorian. He tilted his head just slightly in the way he did when he was pretending to consider something carefully. "You're overworking yourself again, sweetheart. Remember what your mother was like before she got sick. You're starting to remind me of her." My mother had developed early-onset dementia at 58. The fear of following her down that road lived in me the way inherited fears always do, quietly, persistently, in the background of everything. Dorian knew that. He had always known that. And so when he said it the first time and the second and the 12th, I didn't hear it as manipulation. I heard it as confirmation of something I was already afraid of. That is the thing about a lie told by someone you love completely. It doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like the truth you were too frightened to face alone. What Dorian was doing has a name: gaslighting. Not the dramatic, obvious kind, a man screaming that his wife is imagining things. This was small, precise, delivered with warmth and apparent love that from the outside looked like devotion. Every time I began to feel uncertain, there was Dorian with an explanation that made perfect sense and left me feeling not frightened, but guilty. Guilty for doubting him. Guilty for being difficult. Guilty for not appreciating how patiently he managed what he called my episodes. I was not having episodes. I was being poisoned. But that knowledge would come later. There were two people in that house who knew something was wrong. Dorian knew. And on some quiet, buried level I couldn't yet access, so did I. Others suspected too. My assistant Daphne Cole, methodical, loyal, the kind of woman who notices everything and says nothing until the moment she decides the silence has cost enough. And Sterling Ware, the manager of my flagship Midtown property, who knew things about Dorian's finances that I did not, and had been sitting on that knowledge for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. Both of them were about to stop being silent. But before any of that, I want you to understand something. I've spent 2 years and a significant amount of very good therapy learning to say clearly. I was not naive. I was not weak. I was not foolish. I was systematically managed by someone who had spent 2 decades learning exactly how I thought, exactly what I feared, and exactly how to use both against me. 6 months before I stood in front of this mirror on the 63rd floor, I stood in front of another one. In a house I no longer own. In a life I no longer live. The woman who looked back at me from that glass was someone I almost didn't recognize. That is where this story begins. To understand how Dorian Hartwell built the cage I lived inside, you have to go back to the spring of 2004, to a ballroom at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, to a 32-year-old woman in a midnight blue gown who had just inherited her parents' small hotel company and believed with the full sincerity of someone who had never been genuinely deceived that the hardest part of her life was already behind her. That woman was me. The air in that ballroom smelled of gardenias and warm champagne and the particular kind of money that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have to. I wasn't enjoying myself. I was doing what I always did at those events, circulating carefully, saying the right things, counting the minutes until I could leave. And then someone handed me a glass of sparkling water because my champagne flute had been empty for too long. And I looked up to find a man watching me with an expression I had never quite encountered before. Not the reflexive assessment I had grown accustomed to from men in those rooms. Something quieter, something that looked at the time like genuine attention. His name was Dorian Hartwell, financial attorney, tall, silver-templed, possessed of the kind of unhurried self-assurance that belongs to men who have never had to fight very hard for anything. He didn't try to impress me. Most men I met in those rooms spent the first 15 minutes establishing their credentials. Dorian spent them asking about mine. He didn't approach me the way men who want something from you usually do. He was patient. He was deliberate. Looking back now, I understand that patience was itself the tell. But at 32, I read it as respect. A year of careful, unhurried courtship. We married in the autumn of 2005 at the Bellhaven Club, an October afternoon, the maples already turned to amber, the sound visible through the tall windows. My father, Gerald Aldridge, had difficulty standing through the ceremony. My mother, Frances, held his arm the entire time, with the quiet insistence of a woman who had decided that if he was going to fall, she was going to fall with him. Gerald was gone 14 months later. Frances followed 18 months after that. And in that grief raw total, the kind that strips away every instinct except the need to be held together, I handed Dorian everything. He became the legal executor of both my parents' estates. He managed the transfers, the trusts, the structures he designed in language I understood but didn't scrutinize. You're grieving, sweetheart. Let me handle the paperwork. I signed what he put in front of me. I believed he was protecting me. I understand now what he was actually doing. But that understanding came much later. The first crack appeared in 2008, a transfer in the company accounts I didn't recognize. I brought it to him at the kitchen table. He smiled with the patient amusement of a man explaining something obvious, walked me through the tax rationale in careful detail, apologized for not flagging it sooner, and 2 days later surprised me with a week in Venice. By the time we came home, I was ashamed I'd asked. That shame was not an accident. The second crack appeared in 2015 when my memory began doing things it hadn't done before. Names slipping, conversations I was certain I'd had that no one else recalled. I was terrified. I had watched my mother lose herself from the inside out, and that fear lived in me like a splinter. Dorian noticed. He always noticed. I see your mother when I look at you, Vivienne, he said with that careful gentleness I had always mistaken for love. Around this same age. I'm not trying to frighten you. I just want to make sure you get support. He recommended Dr. Pemberton, a quiet, deferential man who ran a private practice in Greenwich and had been managing Hartwell family health matters for years, according to Dorian. Pemberton found nothing concerning. Stress-related fatigue, he said. Perfectly manageable. I should have found my own doctor. I didn't know at 43 to question whose side my husband's preferred physician was actually on. In March of 2023, the evening ritual began. The jade dish, the pink capsule, the glass of room-temperature water. Swiss formulation, sweetheart, the best available. I want to keep you at your best. The forehead kiss, the warm goodnight smile. I took the first one without hesitation. He was my husband. He was taking care of me. That was what he did. The most effective prison is one the prisoner helps build. Every doubt I dismissed, every explanation I accepted, every time I chose his version of reality over my own, I was placing another brick. The walls rose around me so gradually and so elegantly that I had no idea I was inside them. Until the afternoon in July of 2023, when someone rang the doorbell of the Hartwell estate on Round Hill Road. Someone Dorian had spent 15 years ensuring would never be part of my life again. And everything he had so carefully constructed began at last to crack. The quarterly reports were spread across my desk in color-coded stacks the way Daphne always prepared them. And the late afternoon light was coming through the garden windows at that particular angle that turns everything in Connecticut gold for about 40 minutes before it fades. I was making notes in the margin of the Charleston projections when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I set down my pen and opened the front door. I stood there for a full 10 seconds without saying a single word. The woman on my front step was 52 years old, carrying a leather tote bag and wearing the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and is now realizing in real time that none of it is going to come out right. Her hair was shorter than I remembered. but the eyes dark precise. With that quality of someone genuinely listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak were exactly the same. Vivienne, she said. Celeste, I said. Dr. Celeste Monroe and I had been best friends from the first week of freshman year at Georgetown, inseparable for the better part of a decade. And then, 15 years ago, the friendship simply faded. The way friendships sometimes do, I had always told myself. Life gets busy. People drift. That was what I had told myself. That was what Dorian had told me. Those two things I was about to learn were not remotely the same. We sat in the front parlor with tea. The first 20 minutes were the carefulness of people who care about each other and are not yet sure how much damage the time between them has done. And then I asked the question I'd been circling since I opened the door. Why now, Celeste, after 15 years? Why now? She set her teacup down. I was at a conference in Boston last month. Someone from your operations team mentioned in passing that you hadn't been well, that Dorian had been very attentive about managing your care. A pause. So I came. You drove 2 hours without knowing if I'd even opened the door. Yes. She held my gaze. Because the last time I spoke to Dorian, he told me you felt our friendship had become unhealthy, that you needed distance, that you'd asked him to reach out on your behalf. Another pause. He sounded very concerned, very reasonable. I believed him. The tea had stopped steaming. I never said that, I said. I spent 2 years wondering why you'd stopped returning my messages. She nodded slowly as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. I know, she said. I know that now. After that, she watched me differently with the particular observational stillness of someone who has spent 30 years reading bodies for what they can't articulate about themselves. She noticed the tremor in my right hand. She asked about my GP. When I mentioned Pemberton that Dorian had found him arranged the first appointment. Said my old doctor was too conservative, something moved across her face. Not surprise. The expression of a person who has just seen 2 data points align into an unavoidable pattern. She asked to see the capsules. I brought the bottle, dark glass, white label, Swiss pharmaceutical branding. She uncapped it, tipped 1 capsule out, brought it close. She was still for a long moment. Then she placed the bottle on the table between us with the deliberateness of someone choosing their next move very carefully. Has Pemberton ever run a full toxicology panel? Not a full one. Standard annual blood work. She looked at me with the controlled steadiness of a doctor delivering something difficult without letting her own alarm contaminate the delivery. That was the moment Dorian came home. The Georgian latch sounded in the hall, and his voice carried through with its usual composed warmth. He stopped in the doorway. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds, and then Dorian Hartwell smiled, crossed the room, shook Celeste's hand with the ease of a man who has never been caught off guard in his life. He asked about her work. He was, as always, flawlessly calibrated. But I was watching his eyes. For the first time in 20 years, I was watching his eyes rather than listening to his voice. They were measuring, calculating. The eyes of a man assessing every variable in a room he hadn't expected to walk into. Celeste slipped the bottle of capsules into her tote bag with a small natural movement. Dorian noticed. He said nothing. When he excused himself to his office, Celeste turned to me, immediately, voice low. Is there somewhere we can talk privately while Dorian's not in the house? The way she looked at me when she said it, the stillness of a doctor who has seen something she is not yet ready to name out loud, stopped every other thought I had cold. At 5:25, I watched Dorian go upstairs to change. At 5:31, I heard the front door close behind him. Celeste was at my side before I turned around. She took my hand without saying anything and led me upstairs. We went to the master bathroom, the one room in the house with a lock on the door that Dorian had never shown any particular interest in. Celeste turned the deadbolt. The sound of it sliding home was very small and very loud at the same time. She set her tote bag on the marble vanity, turned to face me, and began to speak with the measured precision of a physician who has decided that a patient needs the full truth and has prepared herself to deliver it. I want to be honest about my first reaction. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was something my mind simply refused to process. The man who kissed my forehead every night and told me he wanted to keep me at my best could not be what Celeste was suggesting. And yet her face was not the face of someone guessing. It was the face of someone who had already done the math. So I laughed, and then I stopped laughing, and then I listened. What Celeste described was not dramatic in the way that danger usually presents itself. No single catastrophic dose, no obvious poison. A low-dose accumulative toxin, the kind that settles into connective tissue, rather than circulating at levels a standard panel would flag. At the doses she suspected, the symptom profile was almost indistinguishable from accelerated aging chronic fatigue, short-term memory disruption, mild cognitive fog, fine motor tremor, unexplained weight loss, skin pallor. The kind of thing a woman in her mid-50s might present to her doctor with, and hear in return, stress-related, entirely consistent with the demands of a growing business, perfectly manageable. The standard blood work Pemberton's been running wouldn't catch it, she said. You'd need a full toxicology screen, targeted panels, the kind of workup that happens when someone is looking for something specific. You're telling me my husband is poisoning me, I said. I'm telling you what the capsule smells like and what your symptoms suggest, she said with that careful clinical stillness. I'm telling you the combination is worth investigating. But Vivienne, you know I don't say things I'm not prepared to stand behind. I did know that. I had known it for 30 years. So I sat on the edge of the bathtub in the marble bathroom of the house I had lived in for 19 years, and I did not say anything for a long time. How does Pemberton fit into this? I finally asked. It wasn't money, she told me. In 2011, a patient in Pemberton's care died following a diagnostic error, a missed finding on imaging that would have been treatable. The family sued. The critical piece of evidence, the original imaging report, disappeared before it could be entered into the record. Dorian had represented Pemberton in those proceedings and been, by all accounts, exceptional. The case collapsed. Pemberton kept his license, and Dorian walked out in possession of the original report, the one that had vanished from the record. Pemberton isn't helping Dorian because he's greedy, Celeste said quietly. He's helping him because he has no other option. Dorian holds the document that could end his career and potentially put him in front of a criminal negligence hearing. It's not something you can simply decide to walk away from. I thought about the quiet, deferential man who had told me I was fine. I thought about the way Dorian had recommended him. My old doctor's too conservative sweetheart. You need someone more current, not more current, more controllable. We left for Hartford 20 minutes before Dorian was due back. Hartford Medical Center was 42 minutes north on I-91. Celeste had called ahead from the bathroom and arranged a full toxicology workup under her credentials. As the ordering physician, I signed a patient consent form under her care protocol, which made the arrangement both private and entirely legal. Not connected to Pemberton's practice in any traceable way, a technician drew 4 vials of blood, labeled them with a number rather than a name, and sent me to a waiting area with a cup of water. Results within 72 hours. I sat in that waiting room and looked at my hands. These hands had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They had held my father's hand in his last weeks and folded my mother's fingers around a rosary she'd stopped believing in, but still found comfort in touching. Capable hands, competent hands. They were trembling on my lap, and I was only just beginning to understand why. Dorian was in his study when I got home. He came out when he heard me poured wine, asked about my day in that warm and attentive way. How did Charleston go? You look tired. Sweetheart and I sat across from him and thought, I do not know who you are. I have shared a bed with you for 20 years, and I do not know a single true thing about you. I said none of that. I smiled. I ate. I told him Charleston was fine. Every evening for the next 3 days, I took the pink capsule from the jade dish, lifted it to my lips, turned away at the precise moment Dorian's attention shifted, and slipped it into the interior pocket of whatever I was wearing. I did not swallow a single one, and I waited. The way it turned out, I had been waiting for 20 years for a truth I had been managed too carefully to let myself see. The board meeting ended at 11:45 on Thursday morning. I shook hands with 6 people, approved the renovation budget for the Miami property, redirected a conversation about Q4 projections that was heading somewhere unproductive, and did all of it with the kind of precision that I imagine surgeons feel when they're operating on someone they know technically flawless internally, somewhere else entirely. I had been doing that for 72 hours. By Saturday morning, I had moved myself into the 22nd floor suite at the Hartwell Grand Midtown, a room I kept permanently reserved for my own use, for the weeks when travel made returning to Greenwich impractical. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan spread out below in that particular way it has on clear July mornings. All silver light and motion, the park visible from the north-facing glass. I had ordered coffee and was sitting with it untouched on the table beside me when my phone rang. It was Celeste, 8:43 a.m. I had spent 3 days telling myself the results would be normal. I had repeated it like a prayer, the quiet, desperate kind that isn't really addressed to anyone, just sent outward into the silence in the hope that the universe is paying attention. Because if the results weren't normal, if what Celeste suspected was real, then nothing in the life I had built across 20 years was what I had believed it to be. And I was not ready for that. And then the results came back. And readiness stopped being a choice. She read them to me in the voice she uses when she is delivering difficult information, measured clear, stripped of everything except the facts. Because facts are the only thing that help and everything else is noise. The toxicology panel had identified elevated levels of a compound consistent with chronic low-dose poisoning. The concentration in my bloodstream indicated exposure over a sustained period. She estimated a minimum of 4 to 5 months, possibly longer. The compound was the kind that accumulates in connective tissue and metabolizes slowly, which was why standard blood work hadn't flagged it. It was also, she said, the kind that at current trajectory levels, if exposure continued for another 3 to 4 months, would begin producing systemic organ stress. The kind that would present, to any physician not specifically looking for it, as the unremarkable deterioration of a woman in her mid-50s. Natural causes, age-appropriate decline, nothing worth investigating. I sat very still when she finished. The coffee on the table beside me was still untouched and had gone cold. 22 floors below. A city of 8 million people was going about it Saturday morning, getting coffee, walking dogs, arguing about nothing in the comfortable way that people argue when nothing is actually wrong. I watched them through the glass and thought about the word systematic, about how long it takes to design something systematic, about how well you have to know a person to destroy them in a way they'll never recognize as destruction. "Vivienne," Celeste said, "are you still there?" "Yes," I said, "I'm here." I don't know exactly when the crying started. I know it wasn't immediately. There was a period of silence first. The particular silence of a mind that has received information too large to process all at once and has simply shut certain doors temporarily to manage the load. And then I thought about the children. Not as an abstract loss. I had made a kind of peace with that, or thought I had. I thought about the specific conversations, the specific moments, lying in bed one Sunday morning in our 4th year of marriage, and telling Dorian that I thought we were ready, that I wanted to start trying, and the way he had pulled me closer and kissed my hair and said, "Not yet, sweetheart. Let's have a little more time, just the two of us. We have so much to build still." And the conversation at 40 when I raised it again, and he said, my health wasn't stable enough, that he'd spoken to Pemberton, that Pemberton had concerns that it wasn't the right time. And I had believed him. I had been grateful for how seriously he took my well-being. And the conversation at 44, when I'd stopped raising it, when I'd decided I had made peace with the decision, when I'd told myself it had been as much my choice as his. It had not been my choice, not any of it. I understood that now, sitting on the 22nd floor with the results of a toxicology panel in my ear, in a way that I had not understood anything in a very long time. Not a choice. A removal. Careful, patient, years long. He had taken something from me and called it consideration, and I had thanked him for it. The tears came then. Not the kind that announce themselves, just the quiet, continuous kind that happen when grief is too large for the usual architecture of crying. Celeste didn't say anything. She set the phone down on speaker and I heard the small sounds of her moving, and then her hand was on mine, warm, steady, and she let me cry until I ran out. It took a while. When I was done, I dried my face with the back of my wrist the way you do when you're not near tissues and you've decided the crying is finished. I looked out at the city. I took a breath. What do? I said. First. Celeste said, you don't confront him. Not yet. Not until you have evidence that can stand up in court. What kind of court? She paused for just a moment. Federal. I looked at her. Federal court. Vivienne, what Dorian has been doing crosses multiple lines. The poisoning, the financial manipulation, Pemberton, the asset structures your parents' estate went into. This isn't a private family matter anymore. This is fraud. This is potentially attempted murder. And some of what he's been doing with the company accounts may involve interstate financial crimes. We need to think bigger than a divorce attorney. Bigger than a divorce attorney. I let that settle. There's a lawyer, I said slowly. Fletcher Crane. He's been my private attorney for about 3 years, not connected to Dorian, not connected to anything Dorian arranged. I used him for a personal real estate transaction in 2020. He doesn't know Dorian. He has no relationship with him at all. Call him Monday, Celeste said. Before anything else. Before you change anything about your routine, before you say anything different to Dorian, before you do anything that might suggest to him that something has shifted. Everything stays exactly the same. You take the capsule every night. I haven't been swallowing them, I said, since Tuesday. A brief silence. Then, good. Keep doing that, but keep the ritual exactly as it appears. He cannot know. I didn't stay long at the hotel after that. There were things to do, and doing things, the specific practical, forward motion of making decisions was the only way I knew how to outrun grief when grief needed to be outrun. I didn't cry again that afternoon. I've thought about why. And the answer I keep arriving at is the one I've learned to trust. Sorrow is a thing you owe yourself, but it has a time. And the time for it was not while I was fighting for my life. That accounting could come later. First you fight. I drove back to Greenwich that evening. The familiar highway, the familiar exits, the familiar stone walls of Belhaven sliding past in the last light. I pulled into the drive, came through the front door and found Dorian in the kitchen. He was at the stove, his back to me, the smell of garlic and olive oil filling the room. He turned when he heard me come in. He smiled. That warm, unhurried, completely familiar smile that I had loved for 20 years. The one I had organized so much of my life around. Perfect timing, sweetheart, he said. Another 5 minutes. And I smiled back at him. And I thought about toxicology panels and federal jurisdiction and a lawyer named Fletcher Crane, and I said, it smells wonderful. It was the finest performance of my life, and I had many more ahead of me. The week that followed was the strangest of my life. From the outside, nothing changed. I attended a dinner at the Belhaven Club on Friday evening, with Dorian sat beside him at a table of 8, smiled at people I had known for 20 years, and discussed summer plans and hotel expansions. I laughed at the right moments. I touched his arm once lightly the way a wife does. Beneath all of it ran something I had no previous name for, a cold, precise, absolute clarity. Dorian had spent years making me doubt my own perception. He had no idea that in doing so, he had simply been sharpening the instincts he was trying to dull. Celeste and I met twice that week. Always at different locations, always with a cover story. We were building a plan carefully from the foundation up, with no shortcuts. The first piece was Celeste's. Through channels that left no traceable record, she obtained a mild botanical compound, natural in origin, used in controlled clinical settings, that in precise doses she would personally supervise. Would produce two visible effects: slightly increased pallor and a marginally slower resting heart rate. Nothing harmful, but enough to convince Dorian that whatever he was administering was still working, that his plan was progressing on schedule. "I'll monitor you every 48 hours, she said. "Any change and we stop immediately." I trusted her judgment. I had trusted it for 30 years. The first time it worked, I almost missed it. A Sunday breakfast. I came downstairs deliberately late, looking washed out in the way the compound produced. Dorian glanced up from his newspaper. His eyes moved over me quickly, the way someone checks a gauge, and for a fraction of a second the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. A flicker. The automatic suppression of something that wasn't supposed to surface. He buried it. He said, "You look tired this morning, sweetheart." "Not especially," I said, and poured my coffee with perfectly steady hands. "I see you. For the first time in 20 years, I see exactly what you are." Fletcher Crane's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Atlantic Street in Stamford, 12 minutes from Greenwich. I had told Dorian I had a site inspection in Westport. I drove myself, because I didn't want the appointment in any calendar anyone else could access. Fletcher was 58, lean, with the particular stillness of an attorney who has spent decades receiving catastrophic information without letting it show. I had used him 3 years prior for a personal real estate transaction, a Vermont property purchased entirely without Dorian's involvement. He knew nothing of Dorian's world. No professional overlap, no shared contacts. That made him the safest person I knew. I told him everything. It took 40 minutes. He listened, made notes, and when I finished, he said, "I need to show you something." What he laid on the table between us was not what I'd expected. 4 companies, each incorporated in Delaware, where corporate disclosure requirements are loose enough to make anonymity straightforward. Each provided on paper a legitimate service to the Hartwell Grand Hotel's portfolio: international legal consultation, insurance assessment, regulatory compliance, market research, proper documentation, valid invoices, all approved through Dorian's oversight of company expenditures. None had ever provided a single actual service. Over approximately 9 years, Fletcher said, payments to these 4 entities total between $4 and $5 million. The structures are layered: nominee directors, intermediary accounts. It's not amateur work. I thought about the 2008 bank statement I had brought to the kitchen table. How many times had there been a kitchen table conversation and a Venice afterward? How many times I had accepted the explanation and folded. "There's more," he said. "Your estate documents, the will, the trust structures, the beneficiary designations. The versions currently on file are not the versions you signed." I looked at him. "The changes are subtle," he said carefully, "but the effect would consolidate virtually your entire estate, personal and corporate, into Dorian's sole control within 48 hours of your death." 48 hours. I let that number settle. "File new documents," I said, immediately, quietly. "I'll begin today," he said. I was back at the estate by 4 o'clock. I had been at my desk perhaps 10 minutes when there was a knock, quiet, tentative, the knock of someone who had been rehearsing whether to knock at all. Daphne Cole opened the door. 11 years alongside me. She had been 26 when I hired her, precise, capable, indispensable within 6 months. She was not someone who cried easily. She was not someone who arrived at doors the way she was arriving at mine, now eyes red at the rims, a manila envelope held with both hands. "I should have come sooner," she said. "Mr. Hartwell found me listening outside his study 2 years ago. He sat me down and explained very calmly exactly what would happen to my career if I ever discussed anything I'd overheard." She set the envelope on my desk. I was afraid, so I stayed quiet, but I kept a record. The written documentation was meticulous. 11 months dated entries, word-for-word notations of conversations she had considered significant. The photographs had been taken from the east guest room window overlooking the side service entrance I rarely thought about. 17 photographs, 9 separate occasions, all between 1 and 3 in the morning, all showing the same thing: men I did not recognize, arriving at the side entrance, and being admitted by someone I could not identify. I counted the photographs. I counted the dates. I looked up at Daphne. She was watching me with the expression of someone who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has finally at great cost set it down. "Thank you," I said. It was inadequate. We both knew it. But it was all I had. Every person Dorian had threatened, isolated, or dismissed because he had not considered them a serious threat had been quietly watching. Sterling's silence had cost him years of sleep. The nature of what Dorian held over him I would not learn in full until September. And now they were speaking. I drove home that evening and sat across from Dorian at dinner. I watched him eat poor wine, ask about my day, and I thought about those photographs, those men, those hours. Before I could do anything else, I needed to understand what had been happening in my own home while I was supposed to be asleep. Before I tell you what I heard through that wall at 2 in the morning, the conversation that changed everything I need to know, you're still with me. Drop a 7 in the comments right now. Just that. It tells me you're here, and it means more than you know. A note before we continue: the story ahead contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. If that's not the content you're looking for, this is a good moment to step away. No judgment at all. But if you're staying, what I'm about to share will make everything that came before. It makes sense. Those photographs kept me awake for 3 nights. I studied each face, each timestamp, each license plate Daphne had recorded in her careful, precise hand. Men I didn't know. Arriving through the side service entrance of my own home, the entrance I never used, the one that opens onto the narrow path along the east garden wall, always between 1 and 3 in the morning. Always on evenings when I had taken the capsule and been by Dorian's design unconscious upstairs. 9 occasions, 11 months, and I had no idea. I had been asleep 20 feet above them in the bed I shared with my husband, with no knowledge that my home had been made into something I hadn't consented to and couldn't yet name. I needed to understand what those men were doing there, and on the night of August 14th, I found out. I have been a light sleeper my entire life. Dorian knew that. It was one of the reasons I understand now that the capsules needed to work as completely as they did. A woman who woke at the sound of a car on the drive, who registered footsteps in the hallway 2 rooms away, who noticed the particular silence that comes when someone in a house is deliberately trying not to be heard. That woman needed to be reliably unconscious by 10 o'clock every night. But that night, for the first time in months, I held the capsule under my tongue. 10:30. The ritual unchanged as always. Dorian at the bedroom door with the jade dish and the glass of water, the Swiss pharmaceutical label facing outward, the warm and practiced smile. I took the capsule, lifted it to my lips, and waited. He kissed my forehead, said goodnight, and pulled the door almost closed behind him. I waited another full minute. Then I removed the capsule and sealed it in the small plastic bag I had been keeping inside the cover of the novel on my nightstand. Evidence. Everything was evidence now. And then I lay in the dark and I waited, completely alert for the first time in, I couldn't remember how long. The house settled around me the way old houses do: small contractions, the tick of cooling pipes, the distant sound of wind off the sound moving through the garden oaks. Dorian's light stayed on in his study until past midnight. I heard it click off at 12:41. I was watching the shadows under the door with the attention of someone who has finally understood that every detail matters. At 2 o'clock exactly, I heard his footsteps on the hardwood of the hall, not toward the bedroom, past it, toward the far end of the corridor and the glass doors that open onto the upper balcony overlooking the south garden. I heard the door slide open. The small sound of summer air, humid and still, the kind of August night that holds heat until well past dawn. Then his voice, low, careful. with an ease in it that I had never heard him use in conversation with me, relaxed in the way that people are only relaxed when they are entirely certain they are not being observed. "She's declining noticeably," he said. "Pemberton confirmed the trajectory is on track. 3 months, maybe less. It'll present exactly the way we planned multi-organ stress consistent with her age and her history. Nobody looks twice at a 56-year-old woman with 2 decades of high-pressure executive work behind her." A pause. I could hear the faint sound of another voice through the phone, too quiet, too distant to make out words. A woman's voice. "The hotel portfolio, the inherited property holdings, the Greenwich estate," Dorian continued. "All of it consolidated within 48 hours. Fletcher handles the estate. The version he has on file isn't the version she signed, so there won't be complications." A low, unhurried sound that it took me a moment to recognize as a laugh. "Mediterranean in the spring, Sabrina. I promised you that." I lay completely still. The voice on the phone said something. Dorian was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted flatter, cooler. The warmth stripped out of it the way you strip paint from a surface to expose what's underneath. "The child question," he said. "She grieved that for 20 years. She never knew that what I was mixing into the wellness supplements from the first year of our marriage wasn't a fertility support formula." A pause. And in the pause, I heard something I can only describe as satisfaction, cold and complete, and entirely without remorse. I never let anything divide what belongs to me. Not a competing claim on her attention, not a competing heir, nothing. Another pause. Another response from the voice I couldn't fully hear. "3 months," he said again. "Be patient." The balcony door slid closed. His footsteps returned along the hall. My bedroom door opened a crack of light, brief, then gone as his eyes adjusted. He crossed the room in the dark with the practiced quiet of a man who had done it many times. He sat on the edge of the bed. He leaned down, and he pressed his lips to my forehead, warm, unhurried, exactly as he had done every night for 20 years. "Sleep well, sweetheart," he said very softly. Then he stood, and he was gone. I did not move for a long time after that. Not because of the compound, not because of fear, because my body had received information that was too large to process all at once, and it was doing the only thing available to it, going very still, while the mind tried to find a container for what it had just been handed. The fertility supplements. The first year of our marriage. 20 years of grieving something he had taken from me deliberately, precisely, with the same careful intention he had brought to everything else. Not a failure of biology, not circumstance. A choice he had made for me without my knowledge, and sustained across 2 decades, without a single moment of what I could identify sitting in that dark bedroom in August as regret. I had thanked him. I had been grateful for his patience, his gentleness, his graceful acceptance of something I believed we had both lost. I had spent 20 years carrying the weight of a grief he had manufactured and handed to me like a gift. The kiss on my forehead was the coldest thing I had ever felt. Not because it frightened me, because in that moment, with absolute and final clarity, I understood something I had been circling for months and had not yet been able to say directly. This man had never loved me, not for a single day of the 20 years I had given him. Not once. I lay in the dark for the rest of that night without moving. Somewhere between 3 in the morning and the first gray light coming through the curtains, something inside me that had been fracturing for months broke through completely. And what remained on the other side was not what I expected. It was not despair. It was not grief, though grief would come later in its own time on its own terms. What remained was something very cold, very clear, and very, very angry. And I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. The alarm went off at 6:30. Dorian's side of the bed 3 feet away from me as it had been for 20 years. I lay completely still and listened to him move through the morning. The alarm silenced. The sound of the shower, that particular sequence, hot water first. Then the adjustment he always made 2 minutes in. The drawer where he kept his shirt second from the top. The one that stuck slightly in humid weather, and that he had never gotten around to having fixed. His footsteps on the stairs unhurried the way they always were. The distant sound of the coffee grinder in the kitchen. 20 years of those sounds, 20 years of that particular morning architecture absorbed so thoroughly that I could have reconstructed it from memory in a silent room. I lay there and listened to all of it with a clarity I had not had in months, perhaps years, and I thought I have been living inside a performance, and I never once knew I was in the audience. 20 years. I turned the number over in my mind the way you turn a stone to see what lies beneath it. What I found there was not love, it was architecture. The most careful, patient, precisely engineered architecture I had ever encountered. And I had been living inside it without ever once seeing the walls. I thought about the children first. I couldn't not. Not as an abstract loss, I had made a kind of provisional peace with that constructed, over years, reinforced with the particular self-discipline of a woman who has decided that grief cannot be allowed to compromise function. I thought about the specific conversations. The Sunday morning in our 4th year when I told him I thought we were ready, and he pulled me close and said, "Not yet. Sweetheart, let's have a little more time, just the two of us." I had heard care in that. I had heard a man who loved what they had and wanted to protect it. I thought about the supplements from the first year of our marriage, the ones I had taken faithfully because he had presented them with such thoughtful attention, because I had trusted him completely. I thought about what he had said on that balcony 12 hours ago in the voice he used when he was certain no one was listening. I never let anything divide what belongs to me. 20 years. Every conversation about timing, about health, about readiness, every gentle, plausible reason, every moment I had grieved, and he had held me through the grief he had manufactured. It rearranged itself in front of me, like a structure whose blueprint I was finally seeing. I had thanked him. I had been grateful for his patience, his gentleness, his graceful acceptance of something I believed we had both lost together. I pressed my face into the pillow and held very still for a long moment, not crying, something beyond crying, the particular stillness of a body that has absorbed a shock too large for the usual outlets. I thought about Celeste. 15 years ago. I had noticed her pull back the calls returned less promptly, the plans that fell through. The gradual fade that I had attributed to the inevitable drift of adult friendships. I had wondered in my worst moments whether I had done something wrong, whether I had been too unavailable, too absorbed in the company, too much the version of myself that Dorian had spent years gently persistently characterizing as difficult. I had been lonely for 15 years, and the reason was a phone call Dorian had made, a single phone call. 15 years. I thought about Sterling. 2 years prior, a conversation I had almost forgotten because Dorian had managed the aftermath so smoothly. Sterling had flagged an anomaly in the hotel accounts, had come to me directly with a summary he'd prepared. I had brought it to Dorian that evening, and Dorian had explained it with his usual patient thoroughness. And 3 days later, I had been on a long weekend in the Berkshires that Dorian had arranged as a surprise. And by the time I returned, the anomaly had been explained, and the weekend had been lovely, and I had felt obscurely and without being able to name why that I owed Dorian an apology for the doubt. The Berkshires, Venice before that, Nantucket after the 2015 medical scare, every time, without a single exception. The pattern was so consistent, so precisely repeating, that I couldn't understand how I had never seen it. The doubt, the explanation, the romantic gesture, the shame, the doubt, the explanation, the romantic gesture, the shame. 18 years of it, cycling with the reliability of a system that had been designed and refined and optimized by a man who understood exactly which levers to pull and in which order. I thought about 2014, 8 months of the worst financial crisis Hartwell Grand Hotels had ever faced, a combination of factors, some market-driven, some structural. One that I now understood was structural in a way I hadn't recognized at the time. 8 months of working 16-hour days fighting for the company, carrying the weight of it entirely alone while Dorian stood beside me, playing the role of devoted husband and quietly, methodically, continuing to drain the very accounts I was fighting to keep solvent. He had held me while I cried about the company. He had told me I was the strongest person he knew. He had meant none of it. By 7:45, I was downstairs. Dorian was in the garden as I had expected his Saturday morning ritual. The newspaper and the coffee and the particular quality of stillness that I had once found deeply restful and now read for exactly what it was, a man at ease with himself. Because a man with no conscience carries no weight. I watched him through the kitchen window for a moment. Then I turned away and picked up my phone. Celeste answered on the second ring. "I heard everything last night," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. "All of it, Celeste." A brief silence. Then, "Are you safe right now?" I looked through the window. Dorian turned a page of his newspaper unhurried in the morning light. "For now," I said. "He doesn't know I was awake. He doesn't know I heard any of it." I paused. But there's something about Sabrina Voss that doesn't fit the picture he was painting. She's not simply a woman he fell for. I could hear it in the way he spoke to her. She has something, some angle of her own that I haven't mapped yet. I can feel it. Celeste was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the particular measured quality of someone who is choosing their next words with care. "Then we need to find out what it is," she said, "before we move." "Yes," I said. "We do." I set the phone down and stood at the kitchen window. Dorian was still in the garden, still reading, still entirely at ease, and I looked at him, really looked at him, with the full, unobstructed clarity of a woman who was done seeing only what she had been taught to see. And I thought about 20 years of architecture, and the fact that I now knew exactly where every load-bearing wall was. I had spent 20 years inside a structure built to contain me. Now I knew the blueprint, and I was going to use every single brick of it to build something else entirely. But first, before anything else, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was facing. Because if Dorian was one kind of predator, Sabrina Voss, I was beginning to understand, was something different. Something with her own design and her own objective. And in a situation this precise, that distinction mattered enormously. I want to tell you about Sabrina Voss. Not because I want to give her more attention than she deserves, but because understanding who she was is essential to understanding everything that came next. She was not simply a younger woman who had wandered into a married man's orbit at the wrong moment. She was, as Fletcher confirmed, 48 hours after I asked him to look. Something considerably more calculated than that. I had expected to feel jealousy when I first saw her photograph. Instead, I felt something colder. A kind of professional recognition. I have negotiated with people like Sabrina Voss for the better part of my career. I simply had never expected to find one operating inside my marriage. Fletcher called me on a Wednesday morning, 10 days into August. I was in my study at the estate, Dorian at his downtown office. Daphne on an errand I had arranged specifically to give myself 2 uninterrupted hours, and I listened to what he had found with the particular focused attention of someone who has decided that no piece of information, however difficult, is worse than the alternative of not knowing. He had pulled public records, court filings, financial disclosures, and a series of other documents whose precise sourcing he described, in terms that made clear he had been thorough without being incautious. What he had assembled in 48 hours was not a complete picture, but it was enough of one. Sabrina Voss was 35 years old. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Soho, a building whose monthly rents, Fletcher noted with the dry precision of a man who checks these things, ran between $8,000 and $12,000. Her declared income filed with the state of New York was consistent with her listed occupation as an independent interior design consultant. The gap between those two figures was not small. 10 years prior in Chicago, there had been a financial fraud case, a scheme involving falsified investment documents, and a series of clients who had trusted her with funds they did not recover. The case had been adjudicated. The record had been substantially cleaned, expunged at the state level. with enough legal work applied to it that finding it required the kind of targeted search that most people would never think to conduct. Someone spent considerable money making this difficult to locate, Fletcher said, which means someone considered it worth concealing. I thought about that. About who, in Sabrina's world, would have the resources and the motivation to fund that kind of legal housekeeping. And then I thought about Dorian, and the answer assembled itself without effort. But it was the next piece that changed the shape of everything. Fletcher had found a connection indirect routed through 2 degrees of separation, but traceable once you knew where to look between Sabrina and a man named Liam Garrett. Garrett had a federal record, 2 convictions related to the trafficking of pharmaceutical compounds outside licensed channels. The kind of case that involves substances that are either controlled, counterfeit, or specifically engineered to avoid classification under existing regulatory frameworks. The kind of substance, in other words, that a person might want if they needed something that worked reliably, accumulated slowly, and didn't announce itself on a standard blood panel. Fletcher had found documentation transaction records, partially obscured but not entirely suggesting that Sabrina had sourced a specific compound through Garrett's network approximately 7 months prior to the date of our conversation. 7 months prior placed that transaction in January of 2023. 2 months before the jade dish appeared on my nightstand in March. She didn't just know about the plan, Fletcher said carefully. She was the one who provided the means. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "So Dorian didn't find the compound on his own?" "No," Fletcher said. "He couldn't have. This particular formulation isn't something you locate through conventional channels. You need to know where to look, and you need a specific kind of connection to access it." Sabrina had both. I thought about the word partner, about what it meant in a context like this one. Dorian had used it to describe our marriage for 20 years. I was beginning to understand that he had a rather more functional definition of the word than I had ever suspected. Sabrina's plan, as Fletcher had reconstructed it from the available evidence, was not complicated. It didn't need to be. She would wait. While Dorian administered the compound and Vivian's health declined, Sabrina would position herself in Dorian's mind in his arrangements, in the financial structures he was building as the beneficiary of what came next. The Mediterranean Spring, the consolidated estate, the clean beginning that Dorian believed he was building for the 2 of them. And then, at a point of her choosing after Vivian was gone, after the estate had transferred, after Dorian believed himself safe, Sabrina would use what she had. The shell companies, the falsified estate documents, the money laundering, the compound and its source. All of it documented, all of it preserved. All of it usable as leverage against a man who had spent 9 years building a structure of financial crime elaborate enough to carry federal charges. She wasn't planning to share the Mediterranean Spring with Dorian. She was planning to own it. Dorian thought he was using Sabrina, I said to Fletcher. And Sabrina was using Dorian, and neither of them had any idea I was watching both of them. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then, with the faint, dry precision that I had come to recognize as his version of approval, "That's an accurate summary, yes." I drove home that afternoon and I thought about what Dorian had in common with Sabrina Voss. It was an affection I didn't believe either of them was capable of what most people mean by that word. It was a shared assumption. The same foundational error made independently by 2 people who had both arrived at my life with the same blind spot. They had both underestimated me. Dorian had chosen Sabrina because he believed she was simple, manageable, a tool calibrated to serve a specific function. He had made the same assessment of me in the spring of 2004, at a charity gala at the Plaza Hotel, when he had looked across a ballroom at a 32-year-old woman in a midnight blue gown and decided she was the right combination of assets and malleability. He was wrong about me. He was wrong about her too. And the beautiful, terrible irony of it was that his consistent habit of underestimating the women in his life was I was beginning to understand. The most reliable mistake he made. But Rowan Steele remained a question I couldn't answer. A man who shared an apartment with Sabrina Voss in Soho. A man who, according to everything Fletcher had been able to find across every available public and semi-public record, generated almost no digital trace whatsoever. No social media presence, no professional listings, a driver's license and a lease agreement, and almost nothing else. In my experience, Fletcher said when I pressed him on it, there are two kinds of people who live like that. People who are hiding from something, and people who are doing something that requires them to be invisible. Which do you think he is? I asked. Fletcher paused. I think that's a question worth finding the answer to before you take another step. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning, Fletcher called me back. And what he told me changed everything I thought I understood about the situation I was in. I was standing at the window of my study at 7:50 that Thursday morning reading through the previous quarter's occupancy reports for the Boston property when my phone rang. Fletcher's name on the screen. I had learned to read his particular silences the way a long pause before he spoke usually meant that what was coming was not information he had decided lightly to deliver. I need you in Stamford today, he said, and I need you to sit down before I explain why. I was in the car within the hour. Fletcher's office looked the same as it always did. The clean lines of it, the legal pad squared precisely at the corner of the desk, the measured quality of light through the north-facing windows. But there was something on the desk that hadn't been there before, a single sheet of paper face down positioned between us. He waited until I had settled into the chair across from him. Then he turned it over. At the top of the page was a name I recognized, Rowan Steele. Below it, a document header I had not expected. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Confidential Informant Agreement. Case reference number redacted. I looked at Fletcher. Rowan Steele is not simply Sabrina's companion, Fletcher said. He is a licensed private investigator who has been operating as a confidential informant for the FBI for the past 2 years. He came to them. They didn't recruit him. I set the paper down on the desk. Why? Fletcher folded his hands. Approximately 10 years ago, Rowan Steele was a junior partner in a real estate investment firm. He had brought in a significant client, a financial attorney, whose portfolio he was managing on a fee basis. That attorney restructured a series of joint venture agreements in a way that was technically legal but financially ruinous for Steele's position. The firm collapsed within 18 months. Steele lost his license temporarily, spent several years rebuilding, and, apparently, spent considerably more time documenting what he believed had been done to him. The attorney, I said. Dorian, Fletcher said. Yes, I absorbed that. Rowan Steele had been watching Dorian Hartwell for 10 years. He had built a private file, and 2 years ago he had walked into an FBI field office and placed it on a table. The Bureau had already opened a preliminary financial investigation, Fletcher continued. Wire fraud. Money laundering. The Delaware shell structures your husband built were eventually going to attract federal attention regardless. Steele's information accelerated that considerably. In exchange for his cooperation, the Bureau agreed to assist with the expungement of a minor offense on his record from 2016. He's been embedded with Sabrina for 14 months. He knew about the shell company documentation she was compiling, but the pharmaceutical sourcing through Liam Garrett was a channel Sabrina kept entirely separate from Rowan until after the purchase was complete. He found out about the compound later, which is why he came to us when he did. He targeted her deliberately. We drove to Hartford that afternoon, not to the medical center, to a different building. A nondescript office suite on the 4th floor of a building on Farmington Avenue that I would not have looked at twice under any other circumstances. Fletcher had arranged it. The appointment was logged under a name that wasn't mine. Agent Renee Calloway was waiting. She was in her mid-40s. I estimated compact precise, with the quality of controlled stillness that I had begun to associate with people who spent their professional lives in rooms where every variable mattered. She wore a dark blazer and had a legal pad open in front of her. She stood when I entered and shook my hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who doesn't waste motion. Mrs. Hartwell, she said. Thank you for coming. I want to be direct with you because I think you've earned that. Please sit down. I sat. She sat. Fletcher took the chair to my left, and for a moment the four of us, myself, Fletcher Calloway, and Rowan Steele, who was seated across the table and whom I was meeting for the first time, occupied the room in silence. Rowan Steele looked in person nothing like what I had imagined from the absence of his digital footprint. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had clearly been lived in at some point and had recovered with interest. He met my eyes directly when I looked at him and said nothing, which I found, under the circumstances, more reassuring than most things people had said to me in recent weeks. I placed everything on the table. The toxicology report, Celeste's documentation, the Hartford Medical Center panel, the compound identification, and the exposure timeline. The contemporaneous written account I had made the morning of August 15th, transcribing every word I could recall from the balcony conversation I had overheard the night before. Daphne's envelope, the photographs, the 11 months of dated observations, the 17 images of men arriving through the side entrance in the hours before dawn. Fletcher's financial analysis, the 4 Delaware shell companies, the 9 years of payments, the falsified estate documents. I laid it out in sequence. I didn't editorialize. I had prepared for this the way I prepared for a board presentation, organized, sourced, with the documentation arranged to tell its own story without requiring the narrator to perform anything. When I finished, Calloway was quiet for a moment. She looked at the materials on the table with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not surprise precisely, but something more like the specific attention of someone who has just seen a piece they've been searching for slide into a puzzle that has been incomplete for a long time. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "what you've brought us today completes a picture we have been building for 3 years. The financial crimes case was strong, the wire fraud, the money laundering, the shell company structures. But without the conspiracy to commit murder, Dorian's attorneys would have had room to negotiate. Significant room." She paused. "What you've provided eliminates that room entirely." She looked at me steadily. "I want you to understand what that means. It means that when we move with everything. There is no plea to a lesser charge. There is no managed exit. There is only the full weight of what he has done." I held her gaze. "Good," I said. The wiretap application was filed with the Federal District Court for the District of Connecticut the following day. The basis: my sworn testimony, the toxicology documentation, the financial evidence Fletcher had compiled, and the corroborating intelligence from Rowan's 2 years as a CI. A federal judge reviewed the application and signed the Title III warrant within 48 hours. From that point forward, every call Dorian made, every call Sabrina made, was being recorded by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, legally, completely, with no possibility of exclusion. Calloway explained the structure that would govern what came next. The FBI would handle the federal charges: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The Connecticut State Attorney's Office, coordinating through the state police, would carry the state charges: attempted murder by poisoning, criminal conspiracy. The Joint Task Force would arrest simultaneously, ensuring that neither jurisdiction's case could be compromised by the other. "We let him keep talking," Calloway said. "The longer he talks, the more complete the record becomes. We will tell you when we're ready to move. When we do, you'll know immediately." She stood. She extended her hand across the table and I shook it. "One more thing," she said. "The people who helped you get here, your attorney, your physician, your assistant." She glanced at the materials on the table. "They took considerable risks. I want you to know that we don't take that lightly." I thought of Celeste in a bathroom on Round Hill Road, turning a capsule over in her hands. Daphne standing at my study door with red-rimmed eyes and a manila envelope. Fletcher. 48 hours of research before our first meeting, out of a combination of professional obligation and something that felt increasingly like genuine conviction. "Neither do I said. I stood outside on Farmington Avenue afterward in the late August Hartford afternoon, the particular quality of that light warm and beginning to angle. The kind that makes everything look briefly like it's been gilded. And I thought about the arithmetic of it. How many people now knew the full truth versus how many people were still trying to hide it? For the first time since any of this had begun, the numbers had shifted. There were still pieces to place before the stage was ready. And the next ones would come from the people Dorian had made the most fundamental mistake of underestimating the women who had been watching from inside his own house. Quietly and for a very long time, waiting for the moment when silence was no longer the safest option. I came back from Hartford to find Daphne standing in the front hall. She was still wearing her coat, the light wool one she kept on the hook by the side door, the one that meant she had been about to leave and had changed her mind. She was holding a second envelope, thicker than the first one. And she was looking at me the way people look at you when they have been carrying something alone for too long and have finally decided they cannot carry it any further. I stopped in the doorway. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "How long have you been waiting?" I said. "About an hour," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd be back before Mr. Hartwell. He's at his downtown office until 7. I set my bag down on the hall table. "Come in, Daphne, come and sit down." Daphne Cole had been beside me for 11 years. She had been 26 when I hired her fresh from a hotel management program, and she had made herself indispensable within 6 months, with a combination of organizational precision and the particular quality of discretion that I had come to understand was rarer and more valuable than almost any other professional trait. She had been present at more conversations, more decisions, more private moments of my working life than I could count. And for 2.5 years, Dorian had used the threat of professional destruction to keep her silent. I had given her the first envelope in Task 6, the photographs, the initial record at the 11 months of documentation she had assembled. This was the rest of it. She sat across from me in the front parlor and told me everything. 2 years and 7 months ago, she had been in the corridor outside Dorian's study, not listening deliberately, she said, but passing, and she had heard enough of a phone call to understand that something was very wrong. Dorian had opened the study door and found her there. He hadn't raised his voice. That, she said, was the part she remembered most clearly, that he had been entirely calm. He had told her in measured, precise terms exactly what he was capable of doing to her professional standing and her reputation if she discussed what she might have heard with anyone. He had named specific people. He had named specific consequences. He was very thorough, Daphne said. Her voice was steady but only just. He had clearly thought about it beforehand. It wasn't improvised. Of course it wasn't, I said. She had stayed quiet. She had protected herself the way anyone in her position would have. But she had started keeping a record because she said she had grown up watching her mother document everything in a difficult marriage, and the habit of documentation as self-protection had been absorbed so early it was nearly instinct. 2 years and 7 months of it. Dates, times, license plates, observations, overheard fragments. Every anomaly she had noticed and not been able to raise. All of it written in her small, careful hand in a series of notebooks she had kept locked in a case at her apartment. I opened the second envelope. The level of detail was extraordinary. Cross-referenced dates, vehicle descriptions with partial plate numbers, notes about timing patterns, the same cars tending to arrive on the same days of the week. The visits always correlating with evenings when the light in our bedroom had been off by 9:30. She had mapped it without knowing what she was mapping. She had simply recorded what she saw faithfully and without interpretation because she had understood instinctively. From that first corridor conversation, that the interpretation might one day be someone else's job. It was one of the most important documents I had ever held. Daphne, I said. I set the envelope down and looked at her directly. You protected me for 2.5 years without my knowledge, without me ever asking you to. While he was threatening you. She looked at the envelope on the table. I didn't know how serious it was, she said. Not until recently. Not until you started changing. And then I knew I had to give you everything I had, whatever it cost me. I reached across the table and took her hand. I held it for a moment and I didn't say anything because there wasn't language adequate for what I was trying to express. She had been 26 when I hired her. She had spent 2.5 years carrying this alone. "Thank you," I said. It was still inadequate. It was all I had and it was true, and she knew it. That evening, after Dorian had gone to bed, I called Celeste. We had spoken to Agent Calloway that afternoon, a brief call encrypted routed through Fletcher's secure line and coordinated what came next. The wiretap had been live for 4 days. The audio record was building. What we needed now was the visual layer footage that placed Dorian's actions in the physical space of the house, synchronized with the audio the Bureau was collecting. Connecticut law was clear on the relevant point. As the co-owner of the property, I had the right to install surveillance equipment in any shared space within the home. Not private spaces exclusively occupied by another person, not bathrooms, not a room that functioned as Dorian's sole domain, but shared spaces. A bedroom we had shared for 19 years. A home office positioned off the main hall that I had always had access to, and that had never been designated as off-limits to me. Dorian had never locked it, because he had never believed I had any reason to enter it with anything other than ordinary domestic purpose. He had not anticipated that ordinary domestic purpose was about to become evidence. The first camera was a small device, civilian grade, the kind used for home monitoring, purchased by Celeste in cash from an electronics retailer 2 counties away. We fitted it inside the spine of a large decorative volume on the shelf beside the bed, the shelf I had arranged myself 15 years ago with books I had chosen. The angle covered the nightstand on Dorian's side, the surface where the jade dish appeared each evening, where the glass of water was placed, where, if our timing was right, the administration of the compound would be visible, framed and documented and time-stamped. The second camera we placed in Dorian's home office. It went into the gap behind a row of legal reference volumes on the lower shelf, thick, unread, the kind of books that serve a decorative function in a certain kind of professional's home, rather than a practical one. The angle covered the desk and the chair and the space where Dorian conducted the phone calls he believed were private. I stood in that office afterward and looked at it. The leather chairs, the framed credentials, the careful performance of a successful man's professional life. And I thought about everything behind it. The Delaware corporations, the falsified estate papers, the compound in the jade dish, the phone calls from the balcony. All of it assembled over 20 years in this room, or rooms like it, by a man who had never once considered the possibility that the woman who lived in this house with him might be paying attention. He had a very consistent blind spot. The following afternoon, I walked across the property line to Constance Aldridge's house. Constance was 71, a widow of 12 years, and had lived next door to the Hartwell estate since before Dorian and I had moved in. She was the kind of neighbor who maintained careful awareness of everything within her sight line, while making a point of commenting on almost none of it, a quality I had always respected, without fully understanding the discipline it required. She grew exceptional dahlias along the eastern fence line and had on several occasions over the years brought arrangements over to the estate without being asked. I knocked. She answered. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that suggested my visit was not entirely unexpected. "Vivienne," she said. "Come in, I'll put the kettle on." We sat in her kitchen, the particular warmth of an older woman's kitchen in early September, the light through the window settling on the dahlias visible through the glass. I told her what I needed. Not everything, not the full arc of it, not the federal investigation, but enough. Enough to ask whether she had seen anything over the years that she had considered mentioning and had not. She was quiet for a long moment. "There were cars," she said finally. "Late at night, 1, 2 in the morning, sometimes later. I'm a light sleeper. I noticed them parked on the service road along the east side of your property. Different cars, but the same pattern. Always on evenings when your bedroom light had gone dark early." She looked at her hands on the table. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to cause trouble with a man like Dorian Hartwell. He's a very forceful presence, and I told myself it wasn't my business. "It's your business now," I said, "if you're willing." She looked at me. 71 years of a life lived carefully watching, carefully saying little, and then she said, "Yes, I'm willing." Every person Dorian had pressured into silence, isolated, dismissed, or simply failed to account for, because they were employees, because they were women, because he had never once credited them with the capacity to organize. To remember to hold a line had become, without his knowledge, part of something he could not see. That evening I placed the last camera and stepped back, and looked at Dorian's office, the leather and the credentials and the performance of it, and I thought about the one remaining piece. The piece that showed exactly where the money had gone. The piece I already knew who was holding. Sterling Ware called me at 7:45 on a Wednesday morning in the second week of September. In 18 years of working together, Sterling had never called before 8 o'clock. Not once. He was a man of meticulous professional habit, every piece of information delivered with the contained precision of someone who understood that in the hotel business, how you communicated a thing was nearly as important as the thing itself. 7:45 was not Sterling's hour. I picked up on the second ring. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "I need to see you today, in person, not at the office." A pause. "There's something I've been holding for a very long time, and I can't hold it any longer." "The suite on 22, I said. 9 o'clock. He arrived exactly on time, carrying a slim briefcase he set on the table without ceremony. 63 years old. Lean and composed, the quiet authority of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades moving through other people's crises without letting them show on his face. He had watched me build this company through 2 recessions and a global pandemic, and what I now understood was a decade-long financial assault conducted by my own husband. Sterling had known something was wrong for years. The reason he stayed quiet was not cowardice. It was the oldest kind of leverage. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Before anything else." "Tell me what you know," I said. "We can discuss what you owe me after." In 2013, Sterling had made a personal tax reporting error, not a criminal matter, but the kind of administrative omission that could end a career built entirely on reputation. Dorian had found out. He had summoned Sterling to a private meeting in 2014 and told him in calm and unremarkable terms that he was aware of the situation. "He never threatened me directly," Sterling said. "He never had to. The knowledge was the threat. Any time I considered raising a concern, he had a response available. So I raised fewer concerns, and over time I raised none." He opened the briefcase and placed a folder on the table. 10 years of it. 4 Delaware Incorporated shell companies structured with layered nominee arrangements, each one providing on paper a legitimate service to Hartwell Hotels' international legal consultation, insurance assessment, regulatory compliance, market research. Sterling had the invoices. He had the internal approval records, each one signed in Dorian's handwriting. He had the payment dates. The receiving account numbers, the reference codes designed to look like routine disbursements. None of the 4 companies had ever produced a single deliverable. "The payments were sized deliberately," Sterling said. "Each transfer stayed below the threshold that triggers automatic reporting requirements, spread across 4 entities. The annual total ran between $300,000 and $400,000. He stopped. $4.2 million, I said. $4.2 million in pool, he confirmed. Give or take. I sat with that number. Extracted from a company I had built and fought for, and very nearly lost during a financial crisis that I understood now had been deepened by the extraction itself. During the months I worked 16-hour days to keep it solvent, the transfers had continued without interruption. He had held my hand through the crisis while picking my pocket with the other. I called Fletcher from the suite while Sterling waited. "The payment structuring alone is a separate federal offense," Fletcher said immediately. "Deliberate sizing below the Bank Secrecy Act threshold carries its own charges independent of the underlying fraud. What Sterling has is the kind of financial evidence juries understand without a forensic accountant." 10 minutes later, I reached Renee Calloway on the encrypted line. "We've been building the financial case for 3 years," she said. "What you've described completes the documentary record. Combined with the wiretap audio and the camera footage, we have everything we need. A pause. We're ready when you are, Mrs. Hartwell. We'll need one more recorded conversation, Dorian confirming the plan in his own words on the wiretap. After that, the signal is yours. I looked at Sterling across the table. Thank you, I said. You came forward when it mattered most. He straightened slightly. I should have come years ago. You came now, I said. That's what counts. $4.2 million. I sat with it on the drive back to Greenwich, the September light coming flat and gold through the windshield, the familiar highway, the familiar exits. That was the price Dorian had placed on our marriage, on my life, on 20 years of trust given completely and received as a resource to harvest. It didn't make me angrier. I had moved past the point where numbers could calibrate my anger, but it made everything very, very clear. That evening, I stood in the kitchen of the house on Round Hill Road and made a decision. Dorian's favorite meal was simple pasta, a good red, something uncomplicated he associated with warmth and ease. I had made it dozens of times across 20 years. I was going to make it one more time. I picked up the phone. "I'm making dinner tonight," I said when he answered. "Be home by 7. A beat. Then warm and unhurried. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart. I'll be there." I set the phone down and stood in the kitchen I had cooked in for 20 years, and I thought about everything that was going to happen at that table. The stage was ready. Before I reveal what I said to him that final night, the words I had been rehearsing for months, the moment 20 years of silence finally ended, comment, "I'm here, so I know you made it this far." Every single comment means the world to me. Quick note. This story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational value. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to step away, but if you've come this far, I think you already know you need to hear how this ends. I cooked dinner that evening. That sounds like a small thing, and I need you to understand that it wasn't. I hadn't cooked a full meal in that house in over a year. Dorian had gradually taken over the kitchen the way he had gradually taken over so many things incrementally, under the guise of helpfulness until his presence filled spaces I hadn't noticed him occupying. He arranged the grocery deliveries. He coordinated with the household staff about menus. He had made himself indispensable in the room in a way that left me over time feeling like a guest in my own kitchen. That evening, I sent him out for wine, and I stood alone in that kitchen and I cooked the meal he loved most. Every movement deliberate, every choice intentional, like a ritual, like a closing argument. I had spent weeks thinking about what I would say when this moment came, whether I'd be able to hold the calm I needed, whether the words would come at all. But sitting across from him at that table, the candles lit the first snow of the season drifting past the dining room window. The pasta steaming in the bowl between us, I found that I had only one real concern. Not whether I could do this, but whether after everything I owed him the truth about Sabrina. I had decided that I did. Not out of kindness, as a final accounting. The first half of dinner was ordinary. That was the part I had prepared myself for, and that still somehow required the most discipline, sitting across from him, watching him eat, listening to him describe a case he'd been working, refill the wine glasses, ask whether I'd heard back from the Charleston property manager. The performance of a normal evening, conducted by both of us for reasons that were now entirely different. He got up at the end of the main course the way he always did and went to the kitchen. He came back with the jade dish and the glass of room-temperature water, and set both in front of me with the unhurried care that I had once read as love. He smiled at me, that warm, practiced, completely familiar smile. I looked at the capsule in the dish. I looked at the hand that had placed it there. And then I looked up at his face. I put my hand over the dish. "Sit down, Dorian," I said. "I have something to tell you." Something shifted in his eyes. Not alarm, not yet. Something more subtle, the flicker of a man whose calibration has been disrupted by an unexpected variable. He sat. I told him everything. I did it without raising my voice, without tears, without anything that could have been described later as a performance. I spoke the way I spoke in boardrooms with precision and sequence, building a case from its foundation upward so that each element supported the next. I told him about the toxicology report. The compound Celeste had identified in July, the exposure timeline, the projected outcome if I had continued taking the capsules through the autumn. I told him about the night of August 14th, what I had heard from the hallway, every word I had been able to recall and transcribe by morning light. I told him about Fletcher and the 4 Delaware shell companies and the $4.2 million and the estate documents that were not the ones I had signed. I told him that the FBI had been recording every call he made since August 21st. He went pale. I watched it happen, the careful, practiced composure that had served him for 6 decades draining from his face like color from a cloth in water. He set his wine glass down. "Vivienne," he started. "I'm not finished," I said. And then I told him about Sabrina Voss. I laid it out the way Fletcher had laid it out for me, methodically, without inflection, giving each piece the space it needed to land. Sabrina's financial fraud record partially expunged. The connection to Liam Garrett and the compound's sourcing. The 2 years she had spent quietly building a parallel documentation of his financial crimes, every shell company, every structured transfer, every offshore account. Rowan Steele's role in helping her compile and verify it. And the plan she had been running alongside his, invisible to him the entire time: wait for Vivienne to die, then use everything she had assembled to own Dorian Hartwell completely. Not share his life, not the Mediterranean Spring. Own him, bleed him, or hand him to federal prosecutors herself with a full evidentiary package, in exchange for immunity and whatever remained of the estate after the asset seizures. Dorian stood up. Not in anger, that was what surprised me. In something I had never seen on his face before. Something that I can only describe as the specific shock of a man who has just understood that he has been played not by the woman he had spent 20 years underestimating, but by the woman he had believed was entirely on his side. "She wouldn't," he said. "She couldn't have." "She did," I said. "Every transfer, every entity, every offshore account. Rowan Steele spent 2 years building that file. The FBI has Sabrina's voice on the wiretap confirming it." In her own words, "Dorian, I'm not asking you to take my word for it." He looked at me. And for the first time in 20 years, the first time I believe in the entire history of our marriage, Dorian Hartwell had nothing to say. The mask was not removed. It didn't fall dramatically. It simply became unnecessary because there was no longer anyone in the room it had been designed for. The performance required an audience that believed in it, and I had stopped believing some time ago. I stood up slowly. I set my napkin on the table, and I looked at him across the candlelight and the remnants of the last meal I would ever cook for him. "I want you to know something before they come in," I said. "I don't hate you, Dorian. Hatred would mean you still had the power to hurt me. What I feel is much simpler than that." I paused. "I finally see you, completely. And I need you to know that I see you so that you understand there is no version of the next chapter of your life in which I didn't." He was still looking at me when I said it, and in his eyes, beneath the shock and the calculation and the beginning of something that might have been in another man, fear, I saw it. The moment he understood that the woman he had spent 20 years engineering into a manageable, predictable, controllable version of herself had been watching him building toward this, and had beaten him not with money or lawyers or force, but with the precise and patient intelligence he had spent 2 decades trying to extinguish. The same intelligence he had sharpened without knowing it every time he tried to dull it. And then I heard the sound I had been waiting for. The front door of the house I had purchased, furnished, loved, and nearly died inside, swinging open. Senior Agent Renee Calloway walked through the front door of the Hartwell estate at 9:47 on the evening of October 15th. Behind her, 2 federal agents and 2 Connecticut State Police officers, the joint task force she had described to me in a Hartford conference room 7 weeks earlier, which had at that point existed only as a coordination structure on paper. It was not on paper anymore. Behind them, all standing quietly just inside the threshold, was Rowan Steele. He looked at me once, gave a single brief nod, and stepped back against the wall. His part in this was finished. Dorian was still standing in the dining room doorway where I had left him. He had not moved toward the hall, had not reached for his phone, had not done any of the things I imagine a less precise man might have done in the seconds between hearing a door open and understanding what it meant. He simply stood there, and when Renee walked past me into the dining room, he watched her the way you watch something you have been dreading without letting yourself name what you were dreading. Renee stopped 3 feet from him and looked at him directly. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "I'm Senior Agent Renee Calloway of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have federal and state warrants for your arrest. Please keep your hands where I can see them." She read him his rights in the measured, unhurried cadence of someone who has done this many times and understands that the purpose of the language is precision, not performance. Dorian stood completely still through all of it. Then she listed the charges. Attempted murder in the first degree under Connecticut statute. Conspiracy to commit murder. Deliberate poisoning with intent to cause death. Wire fraud and money laundering under Federal Statute 4, Delaware Incorporated Entities. 9 years of structured payments, $4.2 million. Forgery of legal documents including testamentary instruments. Organized financial fraud. She said each one clearly without emphasis the way you state facts. Dorian turned and looked at me. It was not a look I can easily categorize even now. It was not rage, and it was not the controlled blankness I had grown accustomed to. It was something stripped the expression of a man who has just seen the full architecture of his defeat and is attempting to process it in real time while standing in the room where it was executed. I looked back at him. "The only thing I regret," I said, "is 20 years of not seeing you clearly." He said nothing. There was nothing I think left to say. Renee's phone buzzed against her palm, a brief vibration she checked without looking away from Dorian. She read the screen for 2 seconds. Then she said, with the same measured neutrality she had used for the charges, "Mr. Hartwell, Sabrina Voss was taken into custody at her Soho residence approximately 4 minutes ago. She was in the process of drafting correspondence to a personal attorney when agents arrived." I watched his face when she said that. It was the only moment in the entire evening, in the entire 20 years, when I saw something on Dorian Hartwell's face that I recognized as genuine. Not the warmth he had performed, not the concern he had deployed. Something real, the specific shock of a man who has just understood that the person he trusted most completely was all along running a separate game. That the loyalty he had believed in was as constructed as everything else in this room. She was going to... He started. He stopped himself, looked at the floor. And in that moment, the man I had been married to for 20 years was briefly terribly visible. Not the elegant attorney, not the practiced deceiver, not the architect of a 20-year fraud. Just a 60-year-old man standing in the dining room of a house he had schemed to own, wearing handcuffs. Having just lost everything to 2 different women simultaneously for reasons he had entirely constructed himself. I had expected to feel nothing for him. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important. I had prepared myself for nothing, and I thought I was ready. I was not ready for grief. Not for him, I want to be precise about this. Not a single ounce of what I felt in that moment was for the man himself. It was for the 32-year-old woman in a midnight blue gown at a charity gala at the plaza who had looked across a ballroom and believed with everything she had that what she found there was real. That woman deserved to be grieved. She had deserved better than what she received. And standing in that dining room at 9:53 on an October evening, watching the police lead her husband toward the door, I let myself feel the full weight of what had been taken from her. I let myself feel it, and then I let it go. Celeste was in the hallway. She had arrived 30 minutes before the task force at my request, because I had known for some weeks that I would not want to stand in this house alone when it was over. Fletcher was beside her, his coat still on his hands in his pockets, watching with the quiet attention of a man who has been working toward this moment for months and is allowing himself briefly to witness its resolution. One of the state officers brought Dorian's coat from the hall closet and helped him into it, a small gesture of ordinary human decency that struck me as more affecting than anything else in the room. Dorian did not look at me again. He walked to the front door and the officers walked with him. And he stepped across the threshold of the house I had bought and decorated and fought for, and very nearly died inside. I stood at the open door and watched them go. The air was cold, the particular cold of a Connecticut October that smells like dry leaves, and the first edge of winter, and the lights of the police vehicles were moving through the darkness of Round Hill Road, past the stone walls, past the oaks I had planted, until the last of them rounded the curve and disappeared. I stood there for a long time after the sound of the engines faded. He had walked out of our house in handcuffs, and I had waited for triumph, and found grief instead clean and specific, and already I could tell, beginning to recede. I had cried for the woman I had been. I would not cry for the man he was. Celeste spoke from behind me. "It's over, Vivian," she said. I turned away from the dark of Round Hill Road. I looked at her standing in the hallway, Celeste Monroe, who had driven 2 hours to my door on a Tuesday afternoon in July and changed the direction of everything, and I said, "Not yet, there's one more thing," because there was a courtroom waiting. And I had been given the chance to stand in it and say out loud in the presence of a judge and a record and the full weight of the law, exactly what had been done to me, to say it clearly, precisely, and in my own words. I was not going to waste that. 8 months passed between the night Dorian was arrested and the morning I walked into the federal courthouse in New Haven, Connecticut. 8 months of grand jury proceedings and pre-trial motions and the methodical, unhurried work of building a case that could not be undone. 8 months of learning to sleep in a house that no longer carried the weight of someone else's deception. 8 months of therapy, of paperwork, of the particular administrative machinery of dismantling a life that has been constructed on fraud. And on a Tuesday morning in late June of 2024, I put on a black suit, walked through those courthouse doors, sat down in my seat, and did not look away. I had testified before regulatory bodies and arbitration panels across 30 years of business. I had sat in rooms where significant amounts of money and significant professional reputations were at stake, and delivered my account with precision and without flinching. Nothing had prepared me for the specific weight of sitting in a federal courtroom and hearing the details of my own attempted murder presented as evidence. There is a particular strangeness to it, hearing your life described in legal language, stripped of everything except dates and dosages and dollar amounts. Hearing the specific compound identified by its chemical classification, hearing the exposure timeline laid out in weeks, hearing the projected outcome, multi-organ failure consistent with age-related decline, read aloud by a federal prosecutor in a tone of technical neutrality, and understanding with the full clarity of a woman who had spent the preceding 8 months leaving nothing unexamined, that every word of it was true. The prosecution built its case in layers, and I want to describe it to you, the way it felt to sit through it, not as a legal summary, but as the experience of watching 20 years of careful, patient deception be systematically disassembled in a room full of strangers. Celeste testified first. She took the witness stand in the composed, precise manner of a physician who has spent 30 years communicating complex information to people who need to understand it clearly. She presented the toxicology results, the compound identification, the concentration levels, the accumulation timeline, the projected physiological trajectory if exposure had continued. She explained in language calibrated for a jury of 12 people without medical training exactly what the substance in the pink capsules would have done to my body and when. The defense cross-examined her for 40 minutes. They did not succeed in undermining a single substantive point. The camera footage came next, the recordings from the 2 devices Celeste and I had positioned in August and September of 2023. The prosecution played 3 clips. In the first, Dorian's hands appeared in frame as he prepared the jade dish. The capsule placed with care, the glass of water positioned precisely. The small ritual of administration performed with the unhurried routine of someone who has done this many times. In the second, his home office, a phone call, his voice clear, discussing with Sabrina a timeline I recognized from the night of August 14th. In the third, the same office, a different evening, financial documents spread across the desk. Account numbers spoken aloud, a confirmation that the most recent transfer had cleared. The jury watched all three clips without expression. I watched the jury. Sterling took the stand and walked the court through 10 years of financial records with the methodical calm of a man who had spent those years watching and waiting and documenting. The four shell companies, the structured payments, the invoices for services that had never been rendered. He had brought every piece of paper he had kept, and he presented each one with the quiet authority of someone who understands that the value of evidence is not in its drama, but in its completeness. Daphne testified about 2.5 years of observation, the photographs, the dated records, the men arriving through the side entrance in the early morning hours. She testified also about the conversation in the corridor outside Dorian's study and the explicit terms of the threat that had followed it. She was composed on the stand and direct in her answers. And I watched two members of the jury lean slightly forward when she described the night she first saw lights on in the basement at 2 in the morning. Constance Aldridge, 71 years old, a widow who grew exceptional dahlias and had spent 15 years watching from the adjacent property, testified about the cars, the pattern, the hours, the particular configuration of a bedroom window dark before 9:30 on evenings when the vehicles appeared. She spoke plainly and without embellishment and was not cross-examined at length, because there was very little about a 71-year-old neighbor's observations that a defense attorney could reasonably attack. Then the wiretap recordings were played. The prosecution introduced 12 separate recordings from the period August 21st through October 14th, 2023. The jury listened to Dorian's voice, the same voice I had heard across 20 years of dinners and conversations, and careful, calibrated reassurances discussing timelines, confirming that the trajectory was proceeding as planned, using the word natural, the way a person uses a word they have rehearsed. They heard Sabrina's responses. They heard the specific conversation about the estate consolidation, about the 48-hour transfer window, about the Mediterranean spring. The defense objected to several of the recordings on procedural grounds. The court overruled all of them. The warrant had been properly obtained, the chain of custody was intact, and the recordings were exactly what they appeared to be. When the final recording ended and the courtroom was quiet, I looked at Dorian. He was staring at the table in front of him with the expression of a man listening to his own voice say things he cannot take back. Dr. Pemberton took the stand on the fourth day of testimony. He was 61 years old. He walked to the witness box with the particular gait of someone carrying considerable weight that has nothing to do with his physical body. He had entered a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecution in exchange for reduced charges, misprision of a felony, rather than the more serious conspiracy count he might otherwise have faced, and the agreement required him to testify fully and truthfully about his relationship with Dorian Hartwell and the nature of the care he had provided to me. He answered every question. He confirmed the 2011 malpractice case, the disappearance of the critical evidence, the meeting with Dorian in which the nature of the arrangement had been established without a single explicit threat being made. He confirmed that he had reviewed my symptoms on multiple occasions, had been aware that the symptom profile was not consistent with simple stress-related fatigue, and had documented his findings in a manner designed to be minimally alarming. And then, near the end of his direct examination, the prosecutor asked him if he had anything he wished to say to the court. He turned toward the gallery. His voice when he spoke was not steady. "I told myself I wasn't directly causing her harm," he said, "that I was simply not preventing it. I told myself that distinction mattered." A pause. "I've spent 2 years telling myself that. I was wrong, and I am deeply, deeply sorry." The courtroom was very quiet. I looked at him. I did not look away. I did not nod. and I did not shake my head. I simply let him see me looking at him clearly and without anything that could have been mistaken for forgiveness or for contempt, and I let that be enough. The defense mounted what case it could. Dorian's attorneys attempted to argue that the toxicology results were the product of a pre-existing medical condition, that the financial structures had been established with Vivian's implicit knowledge and consent, that the recorded conversations had been taken out of context. They attacked the admissibility of the camera footage on the grounds that it had been obtained without the subject's consent. The prosecution introduced the spousal property law analysis Fletcher had prepared. The recordings spoke for themselves. The toxicologist rebutted the medical alternative theory in 11 minutes of redirect examination that left no meaningful ambiguity standing. Dorian and Sabrina tried simultaneously in a joint proceeding spent significant portions of the trial attributing primary responsibility to each other. Their respective attorneys, to their professional credit, attempted to manage this dynamic. They were not entirely successful. The jury went to deliberate at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon. I sat in the corridor with Celeste on my left and Fletcher on my right. None of us spoke very much. There wasn't much to say. The case had been made, the evidence had been presented, and whatever happened in that deliberation room was now outside the jurisdiction of anything I could do or say or prepare. I had spent 8 months building toward this. The building was done. 4 hours and 12 minutes later, the jury came back. The foreperson stood, guilty, on all counts. The word landed in that courtroom the way a stone lands in still water, without drama, without spectacle, with the absolute and irreversible certainty of a thing that has been decided and cannot be undecided. I sat very still and let it settle. I did not cry. I did not feel what I imagine people expect you to feel in that moment. The catharsis, the release, the sense of a weight dramatically lifted. What I felt was quieter than that. Something close to the resolution of a very long tension, the particular quality of silence that comes after a sound, has finally stopped. 20 years of it, over. Several weeks later, I stood up in that same courtroom for the last time, and I said everything that needed to be said. The morning of sentencing, I woke before my alarm. I was staying at a small hotel 2 blocks from the federal courthouse in New Haven, not the Hartwell Grand, not any room that carried his fingerprints on the walls. I stood at the window in the gray early light, holding 4 sheets of paper I had read aloud to Celeste so many times she could have recited them herself. Slow down, she had told me each time. Let the room hear you. I had imagined this morning differently. I had pictured fury vindication, the satisfying weight of a gavel. What I felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. Clarity. The particular stillness that comes not from winning, but from finally seeing a thing completely. I folded the 4 pages, placed them in my breast pocket, and went downstairs to meet Fletcher. The courtroom was a room of practical federal sobriety, wood paneling, fluorescent light gallery benches already half filled. Renee Calloway gave me a single nod from the second row. Dorian was already at the defense table wearing a gray suit I didn't recognize. His hair had gone completely white in the 8 months since October. I had not expected that. Sabrina Voss sat at a separate table to the left. The sorrow I had first noticed in the dining room that October night had not sharpened. It had simply settled into the shape of a fact I had already accepted. Judge Fowler entered at precisely 9 o'clock, and the room rose. I listened to the language of federal law translate 20 years of my life into criminal statutes. Conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, attempted poisoning wire fraud, money laundering in excess of $4 million, forgery of estate documents, organized financial fraud, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. Dorian's attorney spoke for 11 minutes in mitigation. I counted. Then Judge Fowler asked whether the victim wished to address the court. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the podium. You tried to take my life, I said, looking directly at Dorian. Not in a single moment of rage, but slowly, carefully, over 20 years. You stole the children I never had. You stole the friendships you erased with a single phone call. You stole the years I spent fighting for a company you were quietly gutting from the inside. You stole the mornings I woke beside someone already counting the time I had left. You stole my trust. You stole my instincts. You stole my body, replacing the reality I knew with the one you constructed around me, and you did it so well that I helped you build it. I laid the bricks myself because you taught me that questioning you was the same as failing you. You cannot take what remains. You cannot take my strength, my reputation, or the woman I was the night I walked into the Plaza Hotel in a blue evening dress with my whole life ahead of me. She is still here. She was patient. She waited. I do not hate you, Dorian. I see you completely. Every layer, every careful decision you made about who I was allowed to be. I see all of it, and I want you to know that before this room decides what to do with the rest of your life. I folded the pages and returned to my seat. Fletcher placed his hand briefly on the arm of my chair, not touching me, just present. Judge Fowler sentenced Dorian Hartwell to 22 years, mandatory minimum 15, before parole, permanent financial felon designation disbarred for life. Sabrina Voss received 15 years, mandatory minimum 9. The gavel came down. It felt like a period at the end of a sentence I had already finished reading. Dorian walked through the side door without looking at me again. And then he was gone. Celeste was waiting in the corridor. She took my hand in both of hers and held it. The courthouse hallway settled into ordinary noise around us. "It's over, Vivian," she said. "Not yet," I said. "There's one more thing." Outside, the July heat met me on the courthouse steps. The air tasted like cut grass and the distant salt of Long Island Sound. I was, for the first time in longer than I could calculate, not afraid of what came next. I breathed in. I breathed out. And I let myself very quietly begin. 3 months after sentencing, on a gray October morning in 2024, I stood in a penthouse on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, surrounded by moving boxes, early light, and the particular silence of a space that belongs to no one but you. I had sold the Greenwich estate 4 weeks earlier. I signed the paperwork without ceremony, handed over the keys, and drove away without checking the rearview mirror. Not because it wasn't hard, but because I had learned that looking back serves you best when you are the one who chooses when and why to do it. I want to be honest with you about what recovery actually looks like. It is not a single moment of relief, not a clean upward arc from broken to whole. It is a Tuesday morning when the first thought in your head is not about him. It is a Wednesday when you think about him again. Slower, more unsteady, and more genuinely human than any version of healing I had ever pictured for myself. The first weeks in the penthouse, I was alone in a way I had not been in 2 decades, but a different kind of alone. Not the alone of a house full of someone else's control. This was the alone of a space I had chosen in a city I knew, on a floor high enough that the street noise arrived softened and indirect, like something happening in a different story. I checked the door locks 3 times before I slept each night. The body keeps records the mind has not yet processed, and mine was still catching up. Most nights I woke at 3 in the morning and lay listening to the building breathe, the elevator cable in the shaft, the wind at 63 floors, and told myself quietly and repeatedly that I was all right. The full physical detox took longer than I had anticipated. Celeste reminded me that the compound had been specifically designed to accumulate in connective tissue and resist the body's natural clearance mechanisms. You're not fighting a cold, Vivian. You're reversing a process that was engineered to be irreversible. Give yourself time. I gave myself time. It did not feel like a gift. But by November, I was waking with something that resembled energy. By January, something in my body that had been braced for a very long time finally quietly released. I returned to Hartwell Hotels on the second Monday of October. Sterling was waiting in the lobby with the full management team, 7 people arranged in no particular formation, just standing. None of them said anything. They were simply acknowledging that I had come back, that this was still mine. I nodded. Sterling nodded. We went upstairs and got to work. One morning in November, in the middle of reviewing occupancy reports, I started crying without warning, without a specific cause. In the middle of an ordinary Tuesday with November rain on the windows. Daphne came in, set a folder on the side table, and sat down across from my desk. She did not ask if I was all right. She did not suggest we reschedule. She simply sat there until I stopped. Then I picked up the Boston report and we reviewed it together. Neither of us mentioned it again. That is, I have come to understand one definition of grace. I told Celeste about it over coffee in Farmington on a Sunday. I admitted that there were still mornings when I reached for my phone out of habit, wanting to tell him something small, and then remembered, and the whole thing arrived again at once. That's not weakness, she said. That's 20 years of habit. The brain reroutes slowly, imperfectly over time. And time, this is the part nobody tells you, time actually works. I was beginning, slowly, to believe her. In December, Dorian's attorneys filed an appeal. Fletcher called it predictable and weak. The Second Circuit denied it 6 weeks later. Renee called to tell me, it's done. I stood at the window afterward and waited to feel something definitive. What arrived instead was a settled emptiness, the absence of fear. I had been afraid for so long that its departure felt, at first, like loss. Then I understood it was not loss at all. That was freedom. Quiet, real, and entirely mine. On a January morning in 2025, I woke at 7 o'clock after 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep, the first time since before Celeste knocked on my door in Greenwich. I lay still and waited for the feeling to clarify. What I felt was not happiness in any dramatic sense. It was simpler. The ordinary, unremarkable peace of waking up and being all right. I let it be what it was. Healing is not a destination you arrive at. It is a practice. A daily decision made again and again on the good days when it is almost easy, and on the hard days when it requires everything you have. It is possible. I am the evidence of that. And then, approximately 8 months after sentencing, I picked up the phone and made a call. Not from strategy, not from anyone's guidance, but from a single question I could not stop asking. What do I do with all of this? With the years, the loss, the hard-won knowledge of how something like this happens, and who it happens to, and why no one talks about it. I had an answer. I was not entirely certain I was ready for it. But I have learned that readiness is a condition you manufacture through action, not one you wait to feel. On the 15th of March 2025, I stood at a podium in a conference hall in Midtown Manhattan and looked out at 340 women. Most were in their 40s and 50s. Some had driven for hours. One had flown in from Fort Lauderdale. They had come because they had seen the announcement, the launch of the Hartwell Foundation, built specifically to support women over 40 navigating financial control, physical harm, or psychological abuse inside their marriages. Women who are statistically the least likely to be believed, the least likely to report, and the most likely to be told they should have known better. I had spoken before congressional subcommittees and international associations for 30 years, but I had never spoken before a room full of people who understood not as observers, but in their own histories and their own bodies precisely what I was about to say. The silence before I began was the most attentive silence I have ever stood inside. Education and resources do not protect you from systematic psychological manipulation, I said. They never have. And it is time we stopped pretending otherwise. The shame that keeps women from speaking is not a reflection of your failure. It is a feature of the abuse itself. It is what was designed to keep you quiet. I introduced the team. Dr. Celeste Monroe as Chief Medical Advisor, leading a physician training program to help clinicians recognize systematic poisoning and chronic abuse in patients presenting with symptoms attributed to ordinary aging. Daphne Cole as Executive Director, the woman who kept 2.5 years of handwritten records at considerable personal risk, who once sat across from me in silence while I cried over an occupancy report, and who answered my offer with 7 words. Let me make it my full-time job. Senior Agent Renee Calloway, partnering on legal education and financial abuse awareness. Sterling Ware on the board of directors seated in the back of the room, unannounced, nodding once when I found him near the door. Then I read the letter. Dear Vivienne at 32. The man who will walk toward you at the hotel gala next spring has already decided what you are worth to him. I want you to know that the number will never include your happiness, your children, or your years. Trust what you feel in your body when something is wrong, not the explanation that follows, not the trip to Venice, not the doctor who finds nothing, the feeling. The strength he will spend 2 decades attempting to drain from you through isolation, through slow and patient poison, through the daily erosion of everything you trust in yourself was never his to take. It belongs to you. He tried. And he failed. Trust God in the moments when nothing makes sense. Trust Celeste when she comes back. And trust yourself always, always trust yourself even when someone has worked very hard to teach you not to. The life you will build from the wreckage of what he causes will matter to more women than you can imagine. Hold on to that. It is worth everything it costs. With love, Vivienne at 56. I folded the pages and looked out at 340 women. You are not invisible. You are not too old to matter. You are not too late to begin again. God sees what has been done to you, and I see it, and we are not going anywhere. Afterward, I stood alone at the foundation office window on the 14th floor. Manhattan in March was just beginning to turn the trees along Central Park not yet green, but no longer bare. I did not need to find myself again. I needed to remember who I had always been. And it turns out she was there the entire time. Patient, whole, waiting. My name is Vivienne Hartwell. I am 56 years old. I survived. I told the truth. And I am only just beginning. If any part of this story has reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. God sees you in that room, and so do I. You are not alone. You are believed. And you are going to be all right, I promise. If this family drama story taught me one thing, it's that the most effective prison is the one you help build yourself every time you dismiss a doubt, you lay another brick. Don't be like me. Don't wait 20 years to trust what your body already knows. Don't confuse his explanations for truth or your silence for peace. When something feels persistently, quietly wrong, that feeling is not weakness. It is the most important information you will ever receive. Act on it sooner than I did. I believe God placed the right people back in my life at the exact moment I needed them. Not coincidence. Something larger at work. These family revenge stories don't always begin with anger. Sometimes they begin with a woman who simply decides her life is worth fighting for. That is the only revenge that lasts, not what you take from someone, but what you refuse to let them take from you. If this family drama story felt familiar, share it. Someone you know may need it more than you realize. These family revenge stories are far more common than anyone admits, and the more we talk about them, the less power they hold. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if this family drama story moved, you pass it on. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for educational purposes. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here.
That's the full story. I appreciate you being here. I will see you in the next one.